prompt to read this expression, the continuum of improvisation, as the continuum of improvisational practices. And by that, we can actually mean two different things, and that's why I've put over there. There is first this idea of a continuum between composition and improvisation. So the idea is that there is a continuum of creative processes. There is no difference in nature between improvisation and composition. Only difference in degrees. But okay, so that's the first way to understand the continuum of improvisation. It's a continuum between composition and improvisation. The other way to understand this idea of a continuum of improvisation is to create a distinction between scripted performance and improvised performance. So here the idea is that there is a continuum in the determination processes. That's the idea, which is quite sensitive, that improvisation comes in degree, that you have degrees of improvisation, that certain performances are more improvised than other performances. Okay, so we have these two different continuums, these two different ways of understanding this idea of a continuum of improvisation. So the first, maybe the most clear formulation of the first continuum, this idea of a continuum between composition and improvisation, is found in Bruno Nettel's papers, Thoughts on Improvisation, a Comparative Approach. It's really a classic from ethnomusicology. And it shows many interesting things in this paper. So first, it shows that defining improvisation must not be done in relation to notation, because of course it's not because something is not notated that it is necessarily improvised. Okay, so that's the first distinction he makes in this paper, that improvisation is not non-notation. Okay, but the more substantial and more interesting part for us is a comparison he makes between different forms of American Indian folk music. And basically he says that, okay, so you can find different kind of American Indian folk music. They are not so different in terms of their, let's say, stylistic properties, musical properties, sonic properties. But the way the musicians find or create these songs are very different. So he makes a contrast between, for example, the plain Indians, and he says that the songs come to them during periods of ecstasy. So it's really a typical act of sudden creation. And on the other hand, the Pima Indians, and for them, so he describes this, the songs exist in the supernatural world, but have to be unraveled by humans. So it's a discovery process that can take a long time, in which the song is refined until it has been got right. So something that in this kind of description sounds a bit more compositional. And he goes on saying, but we could do exactly the same contrast when we think of Schubert and Beethoven. We can think of Schubert as someone who composed very spontaneously, very easily, very quickly, and of Beethoven as someone who will struggle with his ideas, spending a lot of time to find the exact right way to put the melodies, put the harmony, etc. Okay, so you see, this kind of contrast has nothing to do specifically with oral music. You can find exactly the same kind of contrast also in written Western composition. And here is the important sentence from the paper. Would we not do well to think of composition and improvisation as opposite ends of a continuum, with a Schubert and a Beethoven as the extremes, likewise with the improvising Eskimo at one extreme, the Pima at the other, and the plain Indians somewhere in the middle. So the idea of Bruno Nettel is to say that there is a continuum of creative processes in terms of their spontaneity. Some creative processes are very spontaneous, some creative processes are very deliberate, and there are differences in degrees in between them. But it has nothing to do with composition or improvisation or oral music versus notation. Okay, it's a continuum in the degree of spontaneity in the creative processes. So that's a nice illustration of the first continuum I was telling you about. Now you will find a really clear formulation of the second continuum I was telling you about in Jeff Pressing's paper, a landmark in the studies of the cognitive approach of musical improvisation. So the title of it's a book chapter actually. It's called Cognitive Processes in Improvisation, and you will find here this sentence: there is a continuum of possibilities between the extreme hypothetical limits of pure improvisation and pure composition. These limits are never obtained in live performance because no improviser, even in free improvisation, can avoid the use of previously learned material, and no recreative performer can avoid small variation specific to each occasion. So here the idea is not a difference, it's not a continuum in terms of the difference of spontaneity, it's a continuum in terms of the degree of predetermination. Some performances are more predetermined than others. And he even provides, Jeff Pressing even provides these graphs. You see, you have percentages of improvisation. So traditional Japanese music looks like very, very few improvisation. And on the other end of the spectrum, you will find Persian Avaz, Indian Lap, and then free jazz. Okay, so that's another way to frame this idea of a continuum of improvisation. Again, some performances, but we're speaking about performances now, not creative process, compositional processes. Some performances are more predetermined than others. So some of the elements that will be taken during the performances are predetermined before the performance. So there are many benefits, many advantages with this kind of position, and I must say right away that I'm very sympathetic to this idea of thinking about improvisation and thinking about the relation between improvisation and composition in terms of a continuum. I'm much sympathetic to this idea, even if I will try to somehow refine it today. So, but what are the benefits of this approach? The first benefit, the obvious benefit, is to highlight, is to show clearly that creative processes in general are composite. They are made of many different ways of doing music, of creating music, of thinking about music, and I will show that in a moment. And the other advantages, which is exactly what Jeff Pressing was telling, is that of course there is no such things as creation ex nihilo, of course, and on the other hand, there is no performance is never purely scripted in advance. Everything comes in a degree of predetermination, or in the other hand, degree of spontaneous creation. Okay. So I was just saying before that an interesting take with this idea is to really highlight that creative processes are composite. And indeed, you can, of course, think about the compositional processes that are going on in improvisation, but you can also think about the improvisational processes that are going on in much more standard form of composition. And you can also think about all the hybrid processes, such as indeterminate music, comprovisation, kinds of creations that are difficult to categorize, but if you think in terms of a continuum, it's much more easy to do that just in the middle of the continuum. So I will give you a few examples for each of these three categories taken from my own work on improvisation. And let me catch up here. Okay. So I call that the alternate takes as sketches. So a great way to study compositional processes in improvised performance is to look at alternate takes of performances published in jazz album. And Giant Steps by John Coltrane is really a perfect example because we have 14 different takes recorded on 2 different sessions, and actually 12 takes before the actual master take. So this is a list of all the takes of Giant Steps by John Coltrane from 1959. And here is a transcription I've made with one of my colleagues, Martin Guerpin, of the first choruses by John Coltrane on Giant Steps. So on your left, you're seeing the John Coltrane chorus for the very first take, yes, and on the right, the John Coltrane choruses for the master take. So just by looking at the transcriptions, you can already see something going on. We're just going to listen to maybe a bit of the first take. There is a lot of chatter before, so. Okay, and just now sorry, what's going on? Okay, and the master take? Really much faster. Sorry. It's very well known, so I will we'll skip this part. But the point with the comparison with this very first take and the master take is that it's quite clear that there is a compositional project at play, and this compositional project is very simple: is to saturate the musical space by eliminating every kind of silence. So you can really see that by comparing here. There are still a lot of silences in the very first take, and in the last, in the master take, almost every silence has disappeared. Just a few here and there to allow for breathing. That's it. So there is a compositional space, and then when you track down the creative process of John Coltrane along the different tracks, you can see that he's realizing this compositional process through two different kinds of means. First, an optimization process. This means he tries to find the optimal way to do his compositional process. So, for example, it will mean finding continuous melodic lines between distant chords, or at least back in that time, in the late 15th, those chords were considered as distant chords. So that's the first way is doing that through an optimization process. And then there is, of course, a selection and elimination process, which means that there is a melodic crystallization of certain phrases or arpeggios that work particularly well on certain chords, given the ergonomic constraints of the instrument and the others. So the one he tried along the way are just being eliminated as not efficient enough. Okay, so you can really retrace, reconstruct in a way this creative process as a compositional process through the 13 different takes of Giant Steps. So it's like a diffracted compositional process through 13 different performances. Okay. Yeah, here it is. So we've looked at these compositional processes in jazz improvisation, but you can also look at such compositional process, even in freer form of improvisation, so even in free, so-called free improvisation. So another study I've made was to follow the racing process of a free improvisation duet between pianist Eve Risser and clarinet player Joris Ruhl. So what I did is that I organized listening sessions with the two musicians taken individually. So they listened to four improvisations that were from the very beginning of their duets, okay, and four other improvisations that were taken like a year before I just did this session. So much more recent performances. And of course, they didn't know to which performance they were listening to. Okay, and I just asked them to listen to these performances with me, to describe the music they were hearing in their own terms, so to see the kind of terms they will use to describe their own music. And then I asked them in a more systematic fashion to rate the degree of typicality for each passage, for each idea, for each sequence. So, for example, the beginning, do you think that what you just heard is very typical, is typical of what you're doing, is okay, not so typical, but not so untypical either, or it's very non-typical from what we're doing usually. Okay, so they rated their own performances while listening back in terms of their degree of typicality. So typicality again in the sense that how often this kind of sequence will normally occur in a given performance by the group. Okay, and again, just by looking at the comparison between the two figures, you can see a standardization process at play. So the four first bars in the upper part of the graphs are the more ancient improvisation, okay, more ancient performances, and the next four are the more recent ones. And it's very visual. You can see that in the more recent one, the red parts have almost disappeared. So that's the very surprising part, the very non-typical part. They're almost disappeared, and there is much more yellow, which means a very highly typical part. That's really something we are doing really often when we're playing together. So, sorry. So you really can see here this standardization process with the elimination of all the kind of sequences that were judged non-typical. Okay. So in the rehearsal, what's going on when those two people rehearse? So I will just show you, or listen. We'll listen. Two examples. One example of the kind of situations that got progressively eliminated. So that's it, I think. Okay, so this very active post-free jazz with a lot of pitches, very clear individualities. That's typically something that has been discarded by the two musicians in favor of this kind of situation that we are going to listen right now, if it's working. I don't know if you can hear anything. I can't, but it's very soft. So in the rehearsal, the two improvisers, what they're doing is that they define a shared musical territory through listening back to their own performances, discussing what they liked or disliked about it, and negotiating when they do not agree, and selecting what they judge to be the more interesting aspects given the constraints of their instruments, their own aesthetic preferences, and their own individual comfort zone. And in the end, sorry, it's here. Yeah, sorry, I need to juggle between two computers. in the end, it's like they're creating a sort of oral composition through the rehearsing process, because they'll select sonic qualities. So they'll select music or kind of situations where the sound are static, continuous, calm, euphonic. Those are the terms that the improvisers are using themselves to describe the music they're doing. So when they are talking about the music they're doing, they say, yeah, we enjoy doing static stuff, continuous stuff, calm stuff, euphonic stuff. So adjectives that are related to sonic qualities of the music produced. But they also define interactional processes. So, for example, they will say that we like music, we like doing stuff where there are fusion between auto instruments, or illusion, or imitation process. So they also describe interactional processes. And they even described formal processes. So here are two pictures taken from the pianist diary, in which she tried to formalize, in a way, a typical unfolding of their duet performance. So you see there is this main thick line in the middle, so that's, okay, like the main bones of the performance, but around those bones, many peripheral events can occur. So there is really an effort to describe what is their music, what is their musical identity, in terms of many different parameters. Again, in terms of sonic qualities, interactional processes, and formal processes. So when you pile up all that, when you add up all that, it's almost like through rehearsing, through working together, they end up creating a kind of oral composition. So my point here is just that, of course, even in some freer form of improvisation, as long as people are going to work together, to rehearse together, to practice together. For example, this duet has been playing together for 10 years, so you can imagine, that's quite a long time. As long as you have this rehearsing process going on, some kind of oral composition will tend to emerge. So my point here is that even in freer form of improvisation, there is room for compositional processes, even if they are implicit, or in some cases not so much implicit, because, for example, when the pianist is drawing some of this stuff, it's tending to be quite explicit. So I've talked about compositional processes in improvisation, but of course we can also look at improvisational processes in composition. And I will just give a very short example taken from a piece by Carl Negelen, Fenêtre Ovale. It's a series of short pieces for clarinet and piano. And so that's the main score, that's the final score. So you see, no improvisation at all. It's a standard, traditional, conventional score with pitches, rhythm. I mean, there is a bit of freedom, of course, in the duration, but it's not improvised at all. But what is interesting is to look at the creative process behind this finished score. Here is a sketch from this very page that we just saw now. In the sketch, you can see, I mean, we're not going to explain, I'm not going to explain everything in details because it's really not important right now. But you can imagine, maybe you can see that something is crossed. You can see that he's struggling very much in how to develop his very first sequence. And how did he solve his compositional problems? That's my point here. He just asked the two performers to improvise something, you know. So what he asked them, he said, okay, start with this material and try to go to this material. Okay, and it was just a way for him to see if those two materials were in fact compatible. So we just listen to a short excerpt of this guided improvisation. Okay, thank you. Okay, that's the first material, you know, very, very rapid, very active. we won't listen to everything, but and here is the end. Okay, we have this very calm, very static material. Okay, so he was just trying to see, if by having the two performers improvising with these two materials, some kind of connection could emerge between those two very distinct materials. But the conclusion was no. He was not very happy with this. So finally, he found another way to develop his piece by staying with the same calm, static, continuous material. Okay, just listen to a short excerpt. Okay, sorry. It's here. It's here, sorry. So it totally abandoned this idea of a contrast between this kind of material and the very quick, more rapid, with more prepared piano material. So this piece is not the important point here. The important point is just to think about how improvisational processes interacted with the compositional processes in the creation of a score that is otherwise totally you don't need any kind of improvisation to play this piece. You just have to play the notes on the score. Okay, so it's just to show that, of course, and you can think of much more standard and conventional examples. We were talking about Beethoven earlier, but just think about the compositional processes of Beethoven with the constant interaction between what was going on with his sketchbooks and what was going on with his piano. So, of course, even in much more standard, traditional, conventional, Western kind of composition, you have plenty of room for improvisational processes. So you have compositional processes underlying some kind of improvised performance, and also improvisational processes underlying other kind of written composition. Sorry. Okay. And the very last example, very quick, I will go very, very fast with it. I was saying in the beginning that another advantage of this view of a continuum of improvisation is that it can help us to think about much more problematic or much more hybrid cases. So this is just an example of, let's call that indeterminate music. It's a piece called Song by pianist John Tilbury. You know John Tilbury is a pianist from AM. And 2 years ago, he did a project together with ONSEM. ONSEM is a French orchestra dedicated to free improvisation and to the creation of, let's say, experimental music in general. And like a couple of days before their first meeting, their first rehearsal, John Tilbury sends the orchestra this email. So basically, the score is the email. And you see, you can find a small indication like that. The music, I should like the text. It's based on a text by Beckett. Yeah, let me find something. Yeah, I propose that each musician play only sustained individual tones of varying duration, short to long, but mainly long. The overall dynamic, pianissimo to mezzo piano. Occasionally, a loud tone may disturb the piece, but only if you can find such an indulgence in the text which can justify it. So the idea here, you can see that the compositional prescriptions are quite minimal. You know, there's really not a lot of stuff in there. but they still constrain the performers enough so that the musicians do not think of playing that piece as a kind of improvisation. It's clearly something in between, some kind of comprovisation, if you will. So if you think of the relation between composition and improvisation as a continuum, as I was saying earlier, you have something somewhere in the middle of this continuum where you have some kind of constraints, but still a lot of spontaneity and freedom that are allowed to the performers. Here is just a short example.
Ruine, vrai refuge, enfin vers lequel, d'aussi loin, partant.
Okay. So anyway, it's a bit too soft, sorry. But yeah, it's kind of drone-like music. But again, the important point is not the music itself. It's about trying to understand how it's easier to frame what is this kind of creative process if we think of the relation between composition and improvisation as a continuum. Okay, now that was the first part of my presentation, which is all the good things that you can have when you think in terms of a continuum. But now some questions. Okay, it's nice and cool to think of the relation between composition and improvisation in terms of a continuum, but there are still, important differences between the two. Temporal difference. I mean, one is irreversible, the other irreversible. One is in real time, the other is not. That's not slight differences, okay? Instrumentality. To improvise is to create with an instrument. For composition, not necessarily so. I mean, you probably have some kind of imaginary relation, but it's not the same thing as actually playing with an instrument. Ontological difference. If you think of Western music score, they are multi-instantiable works. You can have many versions of each work, many performances of each work. But for improvisation, each improvisation is a unique performance. So on temporal level, instrumental level, ontological level, you still have differences in nature between the two kind of processes, not differences in degree. Okay, so that's the first set of questions we could raise, and I think we should raise. I think we could find answer in terms of a continuum, but those questions need to be addressed. Those differences need to be addressed. The second differences, okay, is to say, okay, there is no creation ex nihilo. That's true. There is nothing like pure improvisation, and there is, on the other hand, nothing like a purely scripted performance where the performer is going to play like a robot with nothing spontaneous emerging in the moment of the performance. That's two illusions. So yes, that's true. But is it possible that there are different kinds of predetermination? So once you've said that, okay, you have difference in degrees of predetermination. Okay. So some performances are more predetermined than others. But maybe they are not predetermined in the same ways. So that's what we are going to see right now. And I think the best way to highlight the complexity of the relation between composition and improvisation is probably to study in detail the creative process of an hybrid project, an experience of co-composition between one composer, in the most classical standard Western sense of the term, of someone writing scores with people playing them, performing them, and 5 improvisers. So that's what I will do now in the second part of this presentation, is just to focus on a specific hybrid comprovisation creative process between one composer, again in the more standard sense, and 5 free improvisers. So I will enter much more in the details of the creative process, not for the sake of it, but just to understand through the many details of the interaction between the composer and the 5 improvisers how it's not that obvious to think of composition as improvisation and of improvisation as composition, because as you will see, the interaction between the six of them was not that easy either. Okay, so this project was called the Sillon project, and as I just said a few seconds ago, it's a collaborative creative process with 5 improvisers and a composer. Sorry, I need to go back here. So it's with the same guy we just heard before, Carl Negelen, the same composer. He loves working with improvisers. And the 5 improvisers are the 5 improvisers from the Umlaut Collective. Pierre-Antoine Badarou is a saxophone player, Sébastien Bella, double bass, Antonin Gerbal, drums, Evry Sir, piano, and Joris Ruhl, that you heard also before, clarinet. And yeah, they're really one of the most dynamic ensembles from the Parisian improvised experimental music scene. Really, really interested ensembles. They're doing many interesting projects. They range from playing swing music from the 20s to experimental stuff. Really a broad artistic activities. Really interesting. So their goal with this project was, to quote the program notes, to take on a treacherous challenge to compose a piece of music together. So this means to compose a piece of music with the 6 members of the collective, again, a composer and 5 improvisers. There were 2 concerts in 2016 in venues mostly dedicated to improvised music, and several rehearsals before. And the important point was that nothing was decided prior to the 3-day residency. So the goal of this residency was precisely to discuss what they wanted to do together and find the best way to implement it. And I was there during this creative process, so I was able to video document the entire process. So I had access to the creative process from the very beginning to the very end. And again, it's very important to understand how such collaboration between composer and improvisers can unfold. So, as I said, the project Sillon can be seen as an attempt to make different ways of composing and different conceptions of what it is to compose coexist in the collaborative creative process. It is an attempt to find a way for the composer and the improvisers to actually co-compose something on which they could share some kind of authorship. And you will see that this question of authorship raises many issues, many questions. And they try different ways to do that. They try different ways, different paths to co-compose, to co-create. Okay, so I will present the 3 paths. The first path is the composer as coach. Okay, the composer is a kind of a coach. He will coach the improviser playing. So yeah, that's what I wrote here. So the idea of the musicians, of the improviser, was to have the composer, Carl Negelen, participate in the debriefings, discussions, and suggestion of ideas for exercise that usually take place in between the quintet's improvisation, and even to let him lead this process. The general idea here being that having the composer shape this moment will confer the composer a certain authority on the music actually improvised by the group, to the point that it could even change the nature of the music produced. And I've put here a quote by Evry Sir. At some point she said, "For me, it won't be anymore an improvisation if we work with you before. You know what I mean." Okay. And here is a short example from this very first day of the residency. So you can see the 5 improvisers just improvising, and the composer here, Carl Negelen, taking notes and listening. and taking notes. Here are a few examples, and giving them some feedback. Here is an example of the feedback the composer gave to the musician. Sometimes we can hear each part very distinctively because they are very different in terms of timbre. But at the same time, we're listening to this as one thing with a life of its own, like a living organism or some kind of vibratory object. And those sound textures are really incredible. But those objects could last longer. I feel that they are gone too quickly, too suddenly. So I'm really wondering, what is happening in your head in those moments? Are you telling yourself, we should stay on this, we should develop it? And the discussion that followed about why the musicians often suddenly stop their individual contribution to the overall sound, thus making the music quite unstable, is very interesting because it clearly reveals the very different perspectives from which the composer and the improvisers approach the question. So here are two answers that the improviser gave about why they relied so much on abrupt cuts and swift juxtaposition of material. So the composer basically just asked them, you're doing terrific thing, beautiful sound, beautiful texture, but why aren't you staying on this and just instead of changing it all the time? Okay, that was his feedback in a nutshell. Okay, and here are the two answers for the musician. So, for example, here is the answer from the saxophone player about the sudden cuts. It's true that it's also to avoid something that will be too comfortable. But for me, it's more than that. It's also to see what is going to happen if I stop. What are Eve or Antonin going to do if I stop what I'm doing? So the clarinet says here. But you could also say, if I want to see what is going to happen, I want to see what is going to happen if I continue to do what I'm playing now. And here is a reply from the saxophone player. Yes, but then I think we all know what's going to happen. It's going to live its life, slowly developing. Once you're settled onto something, it's almost never the case that it's changing rapidly. It's much more predictable. And here is now the answer from the clarinet player about this idea of this question of why are you changing so often the music? About what we were discussing earlier. At one time, I've suddenly shifted to a very high sound, and you, he's speaking to the drummer, you immediately stopped what you were doing on the snare drum, and I really liked it. In fact, I think I like it when we all are strongly coordinated with each other, when you can really hear the connections and the interactions. And here's the double bass player answer, me too. I even use that as a strategy when we are improvising, as if we were switches turning on or turning off each other. So what is interesting here is that they tend to explain their use of sudden cuts and stops in terms of improvising behavior rather than in terms of sonic effects. So basically, the sudden cut, the fact that they cut the music and start something else, sudden cuts are valued by the improvisers because they create zones of indeterminacy or unexpectedness that allow the musicians to display or to test their improvisational talent, understood in terms of creativity, risk-taking, or adaptability under time pressure and strong uncertainty. So in other words, while the composer's feedback is mainly focused in the sounding result, so the complex textures, the intertwined processes created by the musicians, the improvisers are much more interested by the unfolding process itself. So one interesting result of the discussions that followed this exercise is that they help the musician being more aware of the acoustical effects of their improvisational strategies. For example, that they could use individual stop to change the listener's perspective on the sound object by letting come in the foreground a texture that was previously in the background, or that, more interestingly, by allowing themselves to play again the same thing after a break instead of systematically finding something different to play, they could both reinforce the indeterminacy of their stops and inject continuous elements in a general context of discontinuity, thus finding a way to make the composer's musical interest and their own converge. And we just give you two examples of the strategy, because as you can see, the discussion between the composer and the improvisers resulted in the musician appropriation of new developing strategies. So for example, here is the so-called continuity through discontinuity strategy. You will see it, you will hear it, it's quite clear. Okay. And here is an example of the background to foreground strategy, if you will. So again, the important point here is that the two strategies became available through the discussion with the composer. I need to speed up a little. So, conclusion from this first pass, okay? So, using the composer as a coach. On the one hand, the musicians clearly recognize the impact these discussions with Carl Negelen had on their music. As the saxophonist said, when we were improvising yesterday, for me it was obvious that it was also a little bit your music, Carl, that it was related to the discussions we had before, because we had all these things present in our minds while improvising. So that you just heard two examples of that. But on the other hand, they did also question the strength of that impact, and in particular, how well it would resist the test of time, ultimately raising doubts about the fact that the music improvised by the quintet during the concert will still bear the composer's mark. So here's an example of a discussion between the two of the musicians that nicely illustrates just this concern. So here's what the pianist said. It's interesting, when we do exercises and then we're improvising, we can see that the music has changed. But here is the answer from the clarinet player. Yes, but will the music still be changed in 1 month? It's great to do these exercises with Carl, but if we play in 1 month without working again, I think our improvisation will not be very different than if we hadn't do those exercises at all. Okay, the important point here is the element of intentionality. To feel that they're playing something that is not part of what they're doing usually when they're improvising, they need to be able to intentionally refer to something that is exogenous to what they're doing usually. But as soon as those exogenous parts get absorbed in the quintet music, the authorship of the composer just disappears also, and they're just playing their own music. That's what I wrote here. On the contrary, if these elements, so the elements the composer gave them in a way, for example, those two strategies, end up being integrated to the group musical identity, and as such not being consciously referred to during the performance, it is not clear that they will still feel as if they're also playing Carl Negelen's music while improvising. So, as could be expected, after this first experiment of using, ascribing the role of coach to the performer, they try in the last day of the residency to approach the problem from the other end, by soliciting some kind of score from the composer that could be then integrated into the overall performance, and that would indeed guarantee the composer's influence on the performance. So the composer complied with the demand. He wrote a score overnight. He was quite quick, and he brought the score in the next day to the next day's rehearsal. So here is the score. So it's a typical indeterminate score. You have only processes that are written. Yes, sorry. So the new question the musician had to address now was not anymore, is it possible to find a way for the composer to claim some authority on the quintet's improvisation, but rather how to prevent the project from turning into, to quote the pianist, a quintet that is performing a composition by Carl Negelen. So the musician offered 3 different kind of answers to the problem. The first answer is very simple, is that the composition itself, I won't enter in the detail, but the composition itself is a mix between the quintet's music and the composer's own aesthetic preferences. But I will skip that part, but let's just say that the score, the composition, is already a kind of negotiations between the composer's own interest and the group of performers' aesthetic priorities. Okay? Okay, now more interestingly, the notation used by the composer, as you have seen here, okay, it's very indeterminate, right? which allows for a kind of collective writing. The musicians dedicated a large amount of their rehearsal time to collectively determine what was left indeterminate by the composer. This determination was for the most part the result of collective discussions where the musicians negotiate between the composer's original intentions, the improviser's own instrumental, cognitive or coordination constraints, and individual aesthetics judgment. The goal is still to do something that sounds nice together, right? And I will just give you an example of this collective determination process, which I think is very clear and also very, very nice. So let me find here. Okay, there is a part which is very tricky in the score with interlinked loops. So it's in the second system of the score. I will try to after the fermata. So I will just explain quickly what the performers are supposed to do. So the performers are divided in two groups. One group is supposed to play a loop that is gradually becoming shorter and shorter and faster and faster. Okay, so both shorter and faster. And then gradually returning to its initial state. And the other group is doing the reverse, okay? So playing longer and longer and slower, and then going back to initial state at the same time. So it's quite complicated, right? So here is the first reading when the musician discovered the score. So it's not very beautiful, I must warn you. It's sight reading, okay? Trying to figure out what kind of loops they're going to play, experiment with the different speeds. Okay, it fails totally, of course. Okay, it's a bit painful to watch. So they really struggle to play at first, of course. And then they try to play material that they found more interesting, but then it was impossible for them to precisely memorize the loop, because that's another problem, since nothing is written. Okay, so you just have play a loop, shorter and shorter, faster and faster, then go back. Okay, so they try to find more interesting sounds than the pitches you just heard before, but then it was just impossible to keep the loop in mind. But so it was going. Much more interesting in terms of the timbral properties, timbral features, but this idea of loop it's totally lost. So then they had the composer formulate more precisely the kind of effect he wanted in this passage, and he answered, I think my idea is to have a kind of shimmering with sounds that are similar and a range of speed that doesn't vary too widely. So here is the result after this little interaction with the composer. And the very last idea they got is that they found that progressively enlarging or reducing their pitch range will suffice to give the sensation that the loop is becoming longer and longer, or on the contrary, shorter and shorter. So they found a little trick to just give the illusion of a loop becoming longer. It means like with more notes within the loop, or shorter, which means with less notes within the loop. And here is the result. Okay, I don't know if you can hear something, but okay. I can give you the data after if you want to listen to them. And it remained pretty much stable until the very last version. So here is the very last version from that day. again, remember that it was like 20 minutes before what you just heard. It was something like that. Okay. So I know that what I'm showing like now is very, very detailed, but it's to show like in a 20-minute rehearsing time how the interaction between the musician and the composer. You have really this effect of co-composition, co-creation through interaction, discussion, negotiation that allows the musician to go from that to what you just heard before. Okay, so now the very last question those musicians had to face was to decide what's the performance, what the concert will consist of. So the first option they faced was to create a somehow hybrid performance, a mix between composition and improvisation, was to play the composer's highly indeterminate score, deciding what to play exactly and how to play it in the course of the performance, thus actually improvising an important part of the performance. So again, the very first idea was to say, okay, now we have this score, it's very indeterminate, let's just meet at the concert and play that score. This way it will be some kind of mix between improvising and composition. However, this solution was quite quickly dismissed, and here is why. So this is a testimony from the double bass player. I think I would prefer to write my own score, to write exactly what I will play and trying to do better each time. Because now I'm caught in between two fires. I would like it to sound a bit like when we are spontaneously improvising, so with the imperfections, but also with everything that I like, the fact that your ear is your only guide and that everything depends on the fact that you will play the right sound at the right time. But it's not possible, because you're always anticipating what you will have to play next, and you can't pay as much attention to what happens around you and to the choices that you could or couldn't make. In other words, the performance of such an indeterminate score is seen as leading to something that is of a totally different nature than improvisation, a mere imitation of improvisation, where all that is left of improvisation is the imperfections, approximations, and hesitations, but without the heightened sense of agency that is associated with true improvisation. So that's also why they engage in this collective determination process while rehearsing the composer's score, in order not to be in this uncomfortable in-between state during the performance. So the option, sorry, it's here, yeah. So the second option and the last option was to use the composer's score not as a structural or temporal template that the improvisation is supposed to fill in. So, you know, like a framework, and then you fill the blanks, you fill the missing parts, like when you can, that's a way of understanding what is an indeterminate score. It's just we have something indeterminate, and the job of the performer is to go on with the determination process. So it was not to do that, but it was to use the composer score as a context for improvisation. So what they did is that they chose the fragments of the piece that sounded as different as possible from their own improvisations. So this led them, for example, to edit one of the themes they initially selected to start the performance because they realized that, to quote the saxophonist, it sounded a bit like the beginning of an improvisation and not a very good one either. So these points of juncture in the performance where the musicians abandoned Carl composition to start improvising, produce authentically hybrid moments that are a mix between the composer aesthetics and the quintets out aesthetics, moments that are both completely improvised and that clearly bear the influence of the composer's score. So in a way, those moments can be listened to as a progressive weakening of the constraining strength of the composer's works on the improvisational process, or conversely, as a progressive assertion of the performer's agency on the improvisational process. I will go straight to my conclusion, I think, so we can have a bit of time for questions. So the most important thing for the improvisers in the creation of this hybrid performance seems to have been to maintain a principle of retrospective generation. For them, free improvisation in general, but more particularly free improvisation, is perfectly compatible with the fact that musician choices and decisions are constrained by the performance's past. So that's why they try to use the composer scores as a context, but not as something to play as a goal. However, it is not free improvisation anymore if those choices and decisions are constrained by future events. So in other words, while the musicians did not see a problem in the idea of improvising after having performed a piece of pre-composed music. They were much more reluctant to the idea of an improvisation, which would lead to or land on a piece of pre-composed music. So here is my conclusion. So while I'm largely subscribing to the idea of a continuum of improvisational practices, I think it also presents a slight risk, that of undermining the fact that those predetermined or pre-composed elements can take very different forms, which in my sense strongly singularize the various performance practices. In other words, the difference between the performance of a written composition and a free improvisation is not just a matter of more or less predetermination, a difference in the degree of predetermination, if you will. It is also a matter of the specific nature of the predetermined or pre-composed elements that are at play in both cases and that underlie both types of performances. So, are those pre-composed elements, are those predetermined elements implicit or explicit? That's a big difference. Are these predetermined elements ambiguous or unequivocal? That's another big difference. Are they regulative, so they help the performers to do something nice, or normative, you should do that? That's another very important difference. Are they the basis for retrospective generation, so something that you build upon, or the basis for teleologically orienting the performance, something you should aim at? Again, that's hugely different. Another difference, are those elements, those predetermined elements, those pre-composed elements, those sedimented elements, are they intentionally referred to? So you actively, consciously think about that when you're playing? Or are they just embodied as part of a slowly sedimented oral composition? And last but not least, I think that the main important difference is, are those elements contextual, they give a context to improvisation, or are they temporal, they give a temporal unfolding to the performance? And that's a huge difference for the performers and for understanding the phenomenology of their performances. And just a few quotes to illustrate those differences. Some of the improvisers were not particularly happy about the idea of playing a score during the concert. You know, they would say, let's just improvise, you know. Let's forget this composer. Let's just improvise. So in order to convince them, one of the musicians used the following argument. So that's the saxophone player talking. But it's exactly the same as what we were doing yesterday. It's like an exercise, or when we discuss together at music. You can forget the paper from the score, and just tell yourself, okay, let's try something like this and then like that. And the composer, say exactly the same thing. It just allows to be more complex than what we did yesterday. For me, it's just a formalization of the oral instruction that I suggested to you yesterday before improvising. It's not very different. So here's the difference between playing the indeterminate score and the free improvisation is presented as a difference in degree. It's just more complex, more precise, less open. Okay, it's textbook continuum. It's a difference in degree. Okay? More complex, more precise, less open. But here are how the two improvisers reacted to that argument. For example, here's what the double bass said. No, it's very different. If you say, let's try to do this or that, because then you use your ear as your guide. But here, so with the score, you're supposed to follow a precise sequence of events, or if you know where you're supposed to go next. And here is a piano player answer. When the instructions are oral and not written, there is more freedom because you can't tell exactly, it's more vague. You can't check if you're doing right or wrong. She's pointing out the normative content of the score. So in a nutshell, the two modes of predetermination, the oral instruction of the composer and the score he wrote, had dramatically different effects on the musician's behaviors, despite being in both cases initiated by the composer and presented as exercises or steps in the creative process, and thus not as something that will be performed as such in the concert. So, the final conclusion, okay, there are no such things as pure improvisation. Every musical performance results from various determination process. I think we should keep that from the idea of a continuum of performances, of improvisational performances. But it is also very important to be aware of the specific way those determination processes are implemented if we want to understand the singularity of each performance practice. Thank you. One question.
Oh, here it is. It's working. It's working. One question. We have time for one or two questions, and all the other questions will be with the beer afterwards.
Hi, I wanted to ask about this experiment. You said that there was a great difference between the oral and the script and the musicians, but don't you think that the intentionality in both of them are from the composer? Because even...
Exactly. But that's the point. I mean, my point is that even if the intentionality in both cases come from the composer, so you could say it's exactly the same thing in written form or in oral form. Is that the composer intention? But even with what you said, so it's coming from the composer, it still produced very different effects. So I skipped that part from my presentation because of time, but basically the main output was that when they were following the oral instruction of the composer, they were in a much more ludic, exploratory position, so really try stuff. And as soon as they got the score, now the goal was to play the score, to perform the score. Okay, even with a lot of interaction and negotiation, as I showed you with the loop examples, but it totally changed the way the performers thought about the performing situation. The broader issue, I think, is that we should never forget also that scores are cultural objects with a lot of different meanings, norms, cultural ways of approaching those subjects that are at play as soon as there is something like a score. You can say it's exactly what I told you before by just speaking to you. The sheer materiality, the sheer embeddedness of this materiality in our cultural context will change not everything, but many things.
More questions? In the back.
It's more like a remark than a question. It's because you did work with one composer or with more composers?
For this study?
Yeah,
it's a case study, so it's one project.
Yeah, because you affirm things about composition with a very huge assurance of what it is. But if I were you, if you'd like to experiment, you could make like a checklist, with all the characteristics that you think that belongs to one field or another, but without it specifying, put all that together and distribute for a lot of composers and ask them to check what are specified to them, to what they think that's specific to composition, for instance.
Yeah. That's
and
a good idea.
I think you're going to have a very distinctive response from
that's a good idea.
Survey.
Let me just be clear on something, because maybe I was not very clear. I don't think I ascribed any kind of values to what it is to compose. My point is just to say that it's not that easy to mix composition and improvisation, and I'm very agnostic about what it is to compose for a composer. My point is just, if you put people who inscribe themselves in this tradition and other kind of performers like improviser, their interaction is very interesting. It gives some very interesting results also, I think. But it raises many different questions, That's just my point. So it's not to say that improvisation is that, composition is that. I don't think that's what I was trying to do. It's just to say that there are many differences between them. To be even more precise in my answer, the distinction I'm trying to draw is not so much between composition and improvisation, but it's between playing a score or playing, let's say, it's between free improvisation, freely improvising, and improvising with different kind of predetermined elements. That's the main distinction. It's not a distinction, but it's this kind of binaries, that I'm trying to work with. In a nutshell, I think we should think of the continuum between those practices not as unfolding along one dimension. So that will be spontaneity, determination, for example, but along many dimensions. That's basically all what I'm trying to do. And all those are not binaries or oppositions, but are other dimensions that I think we should add to the way we frame let's say, the conceptual space between composition, improvisation. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to do here.
Thank you very much. We have to now leave the premise very quickly because we have only basically 1 minute to do so. Thank you very much, Clément, and see you outside for further questions and chats. Thank you very much.